What's up, everyone? Today, as you can see, we're on part 3 now of el subjuntivo. Part 1, as you guys remember, was how to conjugate a verb in the subjunctive, in the present subjunctive to be specific. And part 2 was sort of building from that and showing where to use that subjunctive conjugation, which was in the second clause. With the first clause having, if the first clause had what we were calling a weirdo, and I had that written up here again. And during that lesson, I said, well, we're going to get to what a weirdo is in more depth in a different lesson. And so with part 3, I wanted to sort of focus in on what this weirdo really is and sort of the verbs that come with it. Now, I've written a number of verbs up here in red, or sort of verbs or expressions that fit the categories. I've written those up here in red. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. I've put in the description box below, I put other links if you want to see other verbs and other expressions associated with the subjunctive, with weirdo. So I'm going to put those in the description box. So if you want more of an exhaustive list, you can check that out. But as far as sort of wrapping our heads around what this whole weirdo idea is, I thought this would be these verbs would be a good starting point or a good point of departure to better understand what's going on. And so I'll explain what these verbs mean so that you understand what they are and how they, what they mean in Spanish. And then I have in green here, as you can see, I have a sample sentence for each one. And I know we did that in part 2, but I wanted to do it again to use one of the weirdos from that particular category in a sentence, so you see how it works. So yeah, let's get right into it. Again, this is part 3 of el subjuntivo, the present subjunctive. And again, as I've said before, I mentioned this already or on multiple occasions. We're trying to understand this concept of how to use the subjunctive mood as opposed to using the indicative, right? And so with that comes this this idea that we call weirdo, right? And I'll just write it up here. Of course, it's written right here down the board, but it's worth writing up here as well. And so each one of these letters stands for a particular category. And with that category comes a whole host of verbs. And so what's important about that is when we talk about these weirdo verbs, like the ones you see in red here, know that they'll be found in the first clause, right? In other words, they'll be found in this part of the sentence. This is the first clause, or the main clause, right? It's called the main clause with this over here, everything after the K being part of the second clause, the dependent clause, or in some cases, it's called the subordinate clause. So, but notice that that K, the word K, sometimes it's called a connector, but it breaks up both clauses, so it allows you to have subject and verb, right? And then K, which breaks it up, and then we get a new subject and verb, right? And so what's important about the weirdo, 2 things. One, it comes with a whole host of verbs, right, in each category, but the weirdo will be found in the first clause. So it will be found in the first sort of part of the sentence if there's 2 clauses, right? You can have multiple clauses, but we're only going to work with 2 clauses. So the weirdo, the verb that is a weirdo, will be found in the first clause, which will obligate you to use the subjunctive in the second clause, or the subordinate or dependent clause, right? And so hopefully once we get through all of this, that'll make sense. And so just to reiterate a little bit, the W stands for will and influences. Now there's other places you'll see wishes, desires, imperatives, but I'm just going with will and influence because that's consistent with what we did in the other video. But again, you'll see other reasons for the W, like I said, like wishes, for example. But we're going to stick with will and influence. I'm going to get a different marker. Let's go with the orange, right? So we've got will and influence here. We've got the E stands for emotions, and so they're the verbs that will accompany this sort of E or this category will come with will be verbs related to emotion, and we'll talk about that in a second. The I here is impersonal expressions. Now, these, as you can see, are sort of sprinkled throughout. And the reason that happens is because well, first and foremost, an impersonal expression is using this right here. It's a conjugation of the verb ser, it's es, which is it is, right? So there's no person attached to it. And so you're not saying, for example, I insist, or I recommend, or we hope. You're just saying it is bad, it is good, it's a shame, right? It isn't true. So that's why those are called impersonal expressions. And so, but again, under emotion, notice you're seeing an impersonal expression as well. So really, it could also fit in this category. But because es increíble, it's incredible, is a expression of emotion, we can also put it under the E for emotion in the emotions in the categories of weirdo, right? And so hopefully that makes sense. But nevertheless, I stands for impersonal expressions. And so again, just to, as I was saying, they can, these expressions, if you will, can go in other categories. And some grammar books will sprinkle them throughout and sort of leave out the I, right, as they try to explain the subjunctive. But I think it's worth first of all, I like that I like the use of the word weirdo. And so because we have that I, we can we're afforded the category impersonal expressions. So that's what these are, and but we'll get to them in just a second. The R stands for recommendations, and so these are sort of orders or recommendations, right? To tell someone to do something, to order, to sort of mandate or command, to recommend, of course, to beg, and then to propose. So again, I'll walk through all of these in just a second once I get through down here, and I'll pronounce them and tell you what these verbs and expressions mean in English, right? And so moving along, we have doubt, disbelief, denial. That's what the D stands for. And these verbs literally just mean to doubt, to not believe, and to deny. And again, we'll go over those in just a second. So, and then last but not least, of course, we have ojalá, which is the O of weirdo, which means hopefully, and also can mean God willing, right? And so we'll look at that one over there once we get down here. And then we have tal vez and quizás. So tal vez and quizás both mean maybe. And this is an interesting one because notice if we put it at the beginning, we use a subjunctive. If we put it at the end, let's make that a Z. If we put it at the end, we're going to use indicative. And I'll get to that in a second. And really what I'm trying to do is make it sort of black and white in a way because, but I'll explain that in a second. So let's kind of bring it back up to the top. And look at some of these verbs, and then I'll look at we'll look at the verbs, and then we'll look at the sample sentence, and then we'll keep moving right along. So for will and influence, we have agradecer. Agradecer is to be grateful or to be thankful, right? Desear is to wish, right? So to be grateful, right? Let's try to spell that right. To wish, right? Esperar is to hope. Right, so I'm going to try to write these up here so you can read them. Querer is to want, right? Of course, as you guys know, when you say like te quiero mucho, it means I love you a lot, but the verb itself means to want. Preferir is to prefer, right? That's a cognate. And so, again, as you can see, these are verbs that are sort of implying will or influence or sort of wishing something. And so this is really where the subjunctive lives, right? The subjunctive is a mood that things either you want something to happen, you recommend something happens, you insist it happens, you propose it happens, you suggest it happens. In other words, it's not going on right now, and it's something you sort of want to come into fruition. The other way, and we'll get down to this one later, but the other reason where the other sort of world that the subjunctive lives in is when you deny something or you doubt something is real or exists, or you're saying that it's not true, right? And so that's what sort of separates the subjunctive from the indicative. Whereas the indicative sort of for all intents and purposes, you're sort of stating the obvious or stating something that is happening or has happened, right? In the case of the preterite and imperfect. So, but the subjunctive sort of lives in that area where, or that world where like you want it to happen. It's not happening, and it very well may happen, but you know you want it to, or you're hoping it will, or as I said, and then of course you doubt that it's happening. So, so that's sort of where the subjunctive deviates, if you will, or is different from the indicative. So, but we'll talk about the difference between subjunctive and indicative on a different lesson. So, but again, we have agradecer, desear, esperar, querer, and preferir, right? And so what you do is, and again, this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just some samples, verbs that fit within this category. So, but again, you would take one of these verbs, right? This is how the subjunctive will work, or this is how the weirdo works as well. So you would take one of these verbs, we're going to use esperar. You would put it in the first part of the sentence, right? The main clause, everything coming before que, essentially, right? And so we would say, we hope, right? That's what we're saying here. Nosotros esperamos que, right? This is our connector that's sort of breaking up the two clauses. So we get one clause with its very own subject and verb, and then the second clause, the subordinate clause, with its own subject and verb, right? So, so in this case, we have esperamos que ellos, which is the subject of the second clause, and then we have tomar más agua. So we hope that they drink more water, right? And so we're going to conjugate tomar in the subjunctive, because we have a weirdo here in the first clause. Right now, of course, as you guys know, that weirdo is specifically a W, right? It's will and influence. But because we have that, a weirdo in the first clause, we then conjugate the verb in the second clause, the subordinate or dependent clause, in the subjunctive. So that's where you'll find the subjunctive is here in the second clause, right? And so just to reiterate, the first clause will actually be indicative. So the weirdo itself will be found, will be conjugated in the indicative, but because it's a weirdo in the first clause, the verb we would use in the second clause is where is the subjunctive. And so I know that might sound a little confusing, but we're going to keep going, and hopefully it'll start to make a bit more sense. We have here verbs of or expressions or verbs of emotion, right? We have here es increíble, which means it's incredible, right? That's an emotion, right? Lamentar is to regret, right? To regret. Molestar is to bother, right? Sentir is to feel, right? Let's try to spell that right. Sorprender is to surprise. Surprise. Let's spell that right. And then temer is to fear, right? So we have, again, es increíble. Lamentar is to regret, right? Molestar is to bother. Sentir is to feel. Sorprender is to surprise. Put that there. Surprise. And temer is to fear, right? And so again, those are verbs and expressions, with this one being an expression, that have with it emotion, right? And so any one of those plugged in here will require you, it's a weirdo, so it will require you to use the subjunctive in the second clause. So let's have a look at this sentence. So we got lamentamos, so we regret that, right? And that's what K translates to, if you're wondering what that translates to, that, at least in this case, because K sort of has all sorts of different translations across the language. But for the case of the subjunctive or these two clauses, that's a pretty good translation for it. So, lamentamos que tu equipo, notice there's no accent here because we're not saying the subject pronoun tu, we're just saying your team, right? Possessive adjective, your team, tu equipo pierda, right? El partido, right? So, perder is an ida stem change. We have the opposite ending. Again, if you're still a little rusty on how to do that, have a look at video number 1, part 1 of the subjunctive. And hopefully that'll be helpful. So, lamentamos que tu equipo pierda el partido, right? And so moving along, again, this sort of provided us a nice little segue here into impersonal expressions. So as I said at the top of this lesson, impersonal expressions are, it's good, it's bad, it's impossible, it's probable, it's possible, right? It's sad, it isn't true, right? Because there's no person, we're just using es, which is a conjugation of the verb ser, to be, right? And so that's why these fit, they get their own category, right? So, es malo, it's bad, es bueno, it's good, es una lástima, it's a shame, right? And then no es verdad. Notice I'm saying here, no es verdad, because what I'm saying is it is not true, right? Because if I were to say it is true, then there would be no, as you see here, doubt, disbelief, and denial. So it wouldn't be subjunctive. So that's why I'm leaving that there as no es verdad. Another one you'll see is no es cierto, right? It isn't true, right? And so those, because we're saying it's not true, we're expressing doubt, disbelief, or denial. And so, like you saw with this one being with emotions, these right here, while they are impersonal expressions, we could, if we wanted, we could put it in this category as well, right? And so, so those impersonal expressions can sort of be sprinkled in different categories because of what they're actually saying. So anyway, so let's have a look here. I'm going to use no es verdad, and then I'm actually going to take away the no and show you what I'm talking about. And so we have no es verdad, so it's not true. So all of a sudden now we're setting up for the subjunctive, because this, of course, is a weirdo, right? No es verdad que yo, we have the verb ser. Ser is one of the irregulars, right? Ir here, we have here ir, which is also an irregular. Saber, another irregular. And so we'll do a video and a lesson on irregulars as well. But these are just sort of, I use those for today for examples. So anyway, so back to this. No es verdad que yo sea, right? That's an irregular verb, so it's not following our traditional subjunctive pattern, right? So like I said, we'll do a different lesson on that. Mecánico. For today, I want to make sure that we understand sort of what this weirdo is and how it's working in these sentences with these different categories. So, no es verdad que yo sea mecánico. It's not true that I am a mechanic, right? And so now let's take away the no. I'm just going to put right here, es verdad que yo soy mecánico, right? Es verdad que yo soy mecánico. This is going to be indicative because I'm saying it's true. So there's no doubt, there's no disbelief, there's no denial. So I'm saying it's true, right? So that's why we would do the indicative there. Whereas here, because I'm saying it's not true, we do the subjunctive. So again, that's a little bit of a segue, if you will, into the difference between subjunctive and indicative. And so let's move on down to recommendations. We have decir, which is to say or to tell. Ordenar, which is to order, right? Which is a cognate, is what it looks like, right? Mandar is to command, right? You can sort of order as well. It can also be to order in a sense. Recomendar, as you would imagine, is to recommend, right? Let's try to spell that right in English. Suplicar is to beg, right? Suplicar. And then proponer, as I said earlier, is to propose, right? Trying to spell this stuff correctly in English. So to propose, there we go. And again, so this isn't an exhaustive list. I know I keep saying that, but I will put more information in the description box so that you guys can sort of expand your vocab, your verbs with this. But again, this is a great starting point. And so let's check out our example we have here for recommendation. So I went with recomendar. Why not? Right? Yo recomiendo que, again, our connector, or sort of breaking up the two clauses. So we got yo recomiendo, clause 1, and then clause 2 here, with the subject of the second clause being ustedes, right? So, yo recomiendo que ustedes vayan, right? Vayan a la playa hoy. So I recommend that you all go to the beach today, right? And again, Bajan or ir is an irregular. It's one of the irregulars, which we'll go over later. But it's agreeing with ustedes, right? Ustedes. So ustedes being the subject of the second clause or of the subordinate or dependent clause, right? And then ir as an irregular, it's third person plural conjugation is vayan, right? And then we're saying to the beach today, right? So recomiendo que ustedes vayan a la playa hoy. I recommend that you go to the beach today, right? Maybe it's super sunny out, so go to the beach. So that brings me to the D here, and that's doubt, disbelief, denial. And so we really have, while there are more, these are some classics, right? This is to doubt, right? Dudar is to doubt. No creer is to not believe them. Actually, not believe. Right? Let's try to spell that right. Right? All right. So not believe, and then negar is to let's write it right here. It's to deny. Now I'm going to add a couple more just for fun, because you can to show you how impersonal expressions can sort of make their way into other categories, like we've seen here. We can put, for example, let's try to spell that right. Es dudoso, right? So it's doubtful. So that's expressing doubt, disbelief, deny, right? Likewise, you can say no es cierto, like I had up there, right? It's not true. So you're saying that it's not true. So therefore, whether it's true or not becomes irrelevant. It's what you're saying. It's the words you're using, right? I can say it's not true that I'm standing here teaching this lesson. Well, clearly that's a lie, but nevertheless, because I'm saying using the words it's not true, I would then use subjunctive in the second clause. So it would sound something like, no es cierto que yo esté aquí enseñando esta lección. And so I would say, esté aquí, right, in the subjunctive, because I started the sentence with no es cierto, right? So, again, so it's all about the words we're using. And so let's have a look here. I decided to use no creo, right? No creo que ellos, and saber to know is an irregular in the subjunctive. So no creo que ellos sepan bailar salsa, right? I don't believe that you all, or they, know how to dance salsa. Now, check this out. If I were to say creo que, now I don't have no, so I'm saying creo que ellos, I would do saben bailar salsa. Why? Well, because now there's no disbelief. I'm just stating something that's, arguably true. I know, or I believe is what I'm saying. And so I believe that they know how to dance salsa. Yo creo que ellos saben bailar salsa. So I hope you can see now like how sort of the subjunctive and the indicative can work, right? Why one over the other. And this one right here is definitely one of the more tricky ones, because it wavers between, like, if there's doubt, well, it's the subjunctive. If there's no doubt, it becomes indicative. And so those very verbs will change meaning whether or not you add a no or take away a no. And so that is definitely challenging. And so that brings me down here. I'm gonna finish with ojalá. And so I'm gonna look at tal vez and quizás. Both mean, as I have here, maybe. And so these are interesting too, because a lot of times if you travel the Spanish-speaking world, I guess if you wanted to sort of take notes on it or do a survey, maybe, I don't know, you might find that when tal vez and quizás start the sentence, for whatever reason, right, maybe you're just kind of leading off with doubt because that's, because you're using that at the beginning. I don't know. But to make it sort of black and white or simplify it for you guys so you can understand it and use it, I'm just going to do it this way, right? So if tal vez and quizás, if you want to use them and you're going to start the sentence out with them, then you're going to use the subjunctive. So if you, for example, wanted to say, maybe we go to the beach today, and you want to start out with maybe, you would say tal vez or quizás, whichever one you prefer. Vayamos a la playa hoy. So you would start, if you start out with that, you have to use the subjunctive. Whereas if you want to say, we're going to go to the beach today, maybe, and put tal vez and quizás on the back end, then you would use the indicative, right? And again, it's more nuanced than that, but for the sake of the lesson, I'm just going to sort of leave it at that, right? And so that's why I have here, vamos a la playa hoy quizás, or vamos a la playa hoy tal vez, right? And so, again, just to sort of reiterate that, if you put tal vez and quizás at the beginning, right, starting a sentence out with maybe, then you need to use the subjunctive with the verb you're going to use. If you put it at the back end, then you can use the indicative, right? And so hopefully that is helpful. And I want to end over here with ojalá. Again, ojalá can mean God willing, and it can mean hopefully. Either way, it's the O of the category. And so, and I have this in parentheses right here because sometimes you'll hear ojalá and then the subjunctive verb, or ojalá que and then the subjunctive verb. That's optional, and that's why I put it in parentheses. You can use it either way you want. Most importantly is you know that the verb you're going to use has to be in the subjunctive. So let's have a look at this. So we've got ojalá que, or ojalá ustedes venir a la clase, or a clase el lunes. Let's do that again. Ojalá ustedes blank a clase el lunes. So hopefully you all come to class on Monday, right? And so because we have ojalá, que again is optional. The subject of the second clause is ustedes, so that means we need to do vengan, right, for venir. It has to be in the subjunctive and it has to agree with ustedes. So, ojalá que ustedes vengan a clase el lunes, or ojalá ustedes vengan a clase el lunes. Either one is totally fine, right? And so, hopefully, this helped to make sense of the weirdo, right? What the categories are, some examples of verbs that are found within those categories, and then where you would see a weirdo in the sentence versus if you see it, where you would use the subjunctive, right, which would be in the subordinate clause, as you guys already know. And so, yeah, so I know there's a lot up here, but hopefully walking through that made it a little clearer, right? Because this is certainly something that's really challenging for folks that are learning it.